Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. The Centre for Social Innovation in Trinity Business School is very happy and indeed honoured to be the hosts for this event. We're here to launch a scoping paper by the UN Special Rapporteur, Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawlor, and it's entitled From Visibility to Vulnerability, When Social Media Fails Human Rights Defenders. And it looks at the impact of social media platforms. Now, the report was published today in several languages, and it's available on the Special Rapporteur's website and also on social media channels. And it will be interesting to see if it is visible on the social media channels today. The event will last 1 hour, and there's a small reception afterwards on the ground floor, to which everyone here is very warmly welcomed. We will hear from each panelist in turn before we open for questions. And one of my jobs is to keep us on time so that we have time for questions. And lastly, the event is being live streamed. So first, I'd like to introduce the panelists. As I said, we're very pleased to be joined by Special Rapporteur Mary Lawlor, and I could continue for the next 5 minutes to tell you more about Mary, but I've not been allowed to, so let her speak. And then on my left, Jade Dussart from Mary's team, who is also the lead researcher on this project and on the report. And then on the far right, Maeve Holland, who is joining us representing Mothers Against Genocide, who is going to give us a real life view of what is happening on social media. And then online, we have Ian Levine, who is formerly of Meta and Human Rights Watch. So to start, our first speaker is Mary. And Mary, you've been in your mandate now for almost 6 years. And it's coming to an end at the end of April. So 31 days from today. Counting today. Why did you choose to focus on this topic now?
Well, I'm going to do for that. So, first of all, I want to thank you, Gemma, for moderating. Gemma is co-director of the Centre for Social Innovation. And I also want to thank the Centre for Social Innovation and the friends from the Centre who are here today. I want to thank Maeve, of course, for coming, and Ian online. So thank you all very much for agreeing to come and speak about your work. So the starting point for my work is the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And it was agreed by all UN member states by consensus in 1998. And it lays out the right held by people to defend and promote human rights. And I've been in the role, as you said, for almost 6 years now. And over that time, I've spoken with thousands of people around the world, exercising the right to defend rights. And it has been the heart of my mandate. Many people cannot exercise their right without fear of reprisal. Some of you will be well aware of this and the risks that you can face if you speak out for standing up for human rights. Every year, hundreds of people are killed in retaliation for their human rights work and for their activism. Many of them are defending rights linked to land and the environment, at the frontier of extractivism. But we also see many defenders killed in urban areas. Women human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and others. And as we speak, hundreds of human rights defenders are arbitrarily detained and locked up for speaking out and organizing for the rights that we all expect and would want from one another. We are at an inflection point when it comes to respect for human rights. But giving meaning to what is written down in law has always been a struggle. It is a struggle that is led by ordinary people all around the world, people who insist that human rights and social justice are not old hat or old irrelevant ideas, but the foundations of the society we all have a right to live in and share, and which we are entitled to as human beings. And the core of that struggle is carried out on the ground, in communities. It happens in the countryside, it happens in cities, it happens in courts, and it happens in the streets. But it also happens online. And the internet is far from a neutral space, as we all know. It is a contested space, dominated by the same interests and ideology that pervade our everyday lives. And online, just like offline, human rights defenders have to struggle to have their voices heard and to protect themselves from attacks. And sometimes these online attacks lead to physical attacks, and sometimes these physical attacks lead to human rights defenders then being killed. Since I took up with the mandate, I've heard constantly about the challenges human rights defenders face on social media platforms, from people here in Ireland condemning the genocide in Gaza, to women human rights defenders in Tunisia, one of whom I met in Tunisia a couple of weeks ago, who's just got an 8-year sentence for working for the rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, and for women's rights. And for human rights journalists in countries like Cambodia and so many other countries around the world. And for those young people who are working, for the against ECOP, which is a big pipeline, which hasn't had proper informed consent by the communities who are affected by it. It's a widespread phenomenon, not linked to any one region, one language, or an issue. And as I come to the end of the mandate, I wanted to look at the problems a bit more closely. And that has led us to the report being launched today. And Jade, who really wrote the report, lead researcher, is not giving her justice. She basically wrote the first draft. And thanks also to Michael. Is going to speak in more detail about it, but I would like you, if you could, to read it and share it and consider the implications, because it gives a glimpse into the challenges faced by people trying to advocate for human rights on social media. And it gives an insight into how those challenges are created by policies of companies operating the platforms and the structure of those very platforms themselves. And it lays out the challenges for states who are responsible for upholding human rights, but have never even come close to it, to bringing the principles of dignity and human rights, respect for human rights, into the online space. So it is a scoping paper. And I look at it as a rallying cry, because the problem with these social media platforms have been clear for a very, very long time. So I'm not the first person to address them, but I think it's important that we keep at it and we persevere, because that's the only way change happens. And with the imposition of AI online, it is only going to become more crucial to consider the kind of space we want the internet to be, and to take action to make it so. It's so easy when you go online and up pops AI with whatever answer it is that you're looking for. And the default position is to read it. So it is very, in my view, very dangerous. There are many recommendations in the report, but the primary one I want to emphasize is to states. I ask states to use the tools at their disposal to regulate the companies operating the platforms. Their models are unsustainable. They are putting people who protect and promote human rights at risk while smothering their information and their messages, which all states claim to support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that compelling case. I'm turning now to, as Mary said, the main author of the first draft of the report, Jade Dussart, who's going to give us an overview of the main findings of the report.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Gemma. So as Mary mentioned, the scoping paper looks at a paradox. Social media has become an essential tool in the toolbox of human rights defenders, but at the same time, many defenders report that these same social media platforms are contributing to risks, silencing, and harm. So our goal with this research was not to produce an exhaustive global study, but rather to map the key patterns that seem to emerge across regions and to identify risks that deserve more attention. Very briefly on methodology, the paper is mostly based on consultations with civil society organizations who work directly alongside human rights defenders across different regions. These consultations were conducted under the Chatham House rules, meaning the responses informed the paper but were not attributed to organizations by name so that they could speak more openly about potentially sensitive cases. And despite the diversity of contexts, we saw very consistent concerns emerging from HRDs about how platform policies and practices are affecting the right to defend human rights. So I'll highlight 5 key findings from the paper. Please bear with me. The first major finding is about the failures in content moderation systems. Across many submissions we received, organizations reported that legitimate human rights content was being removed or restricted on social media by social media platforms. For example, documentation of grave human rights violations in Palestine or in Syria were removed under policies on violent or dangerous content. In Venezuela, legitimate content documenting the repression during the 2024 elections were misclassified by seemingly automated filters as incitement to violence and subsequently blocked. And we also saw concerns about transparency. Defenders often don't know why their content is being removed, which rule was broken, or even whether a human being reviewed the decision. We've seen as well accounts belonging to human rights defenders in Bangladesh, Iran, or even Belgium being automatically suspended after waves of mass reporting from trolls or anti-rights or far-right groups. And defenders don't always find much recourse from the social media platforms when that happens. And so these kind of examples lead us to wonder whether the moderation systems of social media platforms as they are designed properly account for human rights work. And based on what we heard, it seems to not be the case. Another key finding concerns how social media platforms can sometimes comply with restrictive government requests to, for example, remove content, restrict accounts, or provide them with user data, often in the context where defenders are already being targeted. In Turkey, for example, organizations are reporting very high compliance rates with government removal requests. In some cases, above 80 or 90% of the requests are granted. And as an example, in March last year, X, so formerly Twitter, agreed to block hundreds of accounts of human rights defenders, journalists, activist groups on the government's orders. And in another example in Guatemala, one human rights defender reportedly discovered that their personal data had been shared by social media platforms with the authorities without their consent or knowledge. So that raises a difficult question. which is what happens when social media platforms comply with national laws that themselves restrict human rights. And this is clearly an area where more transparency and clearer human rights safeguards are needed. A third finding was the often inadequate response of social media platforms to online attacks against defenders. As Mary mentioned, human rights defenders increasingly face harassment, threats, smears, coordinated attacks on social media that sometimes even involve the use of bots or AI content. And what makes this particularly concerning is that many defenders report very little support from the social media platforms' response systems. Some have described reporting abuse and receiving only automated replies with no follow-up or human contact. Others describe very complex reporting procedures, which are especially difficult for defenders who might not speak English. Some said they had simply stopped reporting the abuse altogether, as they don't believe anything would change. And that creates a chilling effect. It leads to self-censorship, withdrawal from the public debate, and reduced capacity for defenders to do their work without fear. Point four, another important finding we observed was the uneven treatment of users. Several organizations highlighted that they observed disparities depending on language, geography, or topics covered. For example, human rights defenders working in Arabic, Urdu, or Bangla reported weaker moderation capacities, which means in practice that harmful content would remain online, or on the contrary, legitimate human rights content would be taken down incorrectly because it is in those languages. On the other hand, when reporting online abuse, human rights defenders from Africa were less likely to receive a response from social media platforms than their European counterparts. We also saw examples where algorithm changes reduced the reach of LGBT rights content, for example, under the guise of reducing political content. So taken all together, these concerns point to a structural issue, the fact that platforms can unintentionally or not reproduce global inequalities, including whose voices are heard, whose content is protected, and whose safety is prioritized. Finally, the fifth key finding was a weakening engagement between NGOs and social media platforms. Several NGOs told us that it had become harder to maintain dialogue with social media companies in recent years. They've become less responsive. They have dismantled advisory bodies that NGOs belong to, or reduced staffing in their human rights teams or their trust and safety teams. And at the same time, in parallel, NGOs increasingly find themselves having to act as informal intermediaries between human rights defenders and social media companies, helping them escalate cases or navigate the difficult reporting channels. And many of them told us that this is not a sustainable model. The NGO's role is not to fill in the gaps left by the platforms, and protecting HRDs online should not depend on whether someone knows someone who works at a social media platform. Under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that Mary mentioned, it is companies themselves that have the responsibility to prevent and address human rights harms linked to their operations. So finally, we looked at the broader impact. When we look at all these issues together, we see cumulative effects. They affect civic space, they affect who feels confident to speak, and ultimately whose voices are heard. Some defenders have described reducing their online presence, some start to use pseudonym or post less about sensitive topics, or simply move to other platforms. And these impacts are not felt equally. Human rights defenders from marginalized communities, women human rights defenders, and those working on sensitive issues face disproportionate risks of being silenced and excluded from the mainstream platforms. So the question becomes, what happens to human rights advocacy if social media becomes harder for some voices to safely access? Most HRDs who spoke with us told us that disengaging from mainstream platforms is simply not possible at the moment. They remain too essential for their visibility and their advocacy, but at the same time, they constantly calculate risks. how visible can I be? What can I safely say? Will this post put me at risk? So they're facing sort of visibility versus safety dilemma. They need visibility to do their work, but visibility also increases risks. And in practice, many defenders are forced to accept the risk in order to remain visible and continue their work. And that's not a choice human rights defenders should have to make. So ultimately, what we're asking with this paper is for this digital spaces that now function as global public squares to allow all human rights defenders to safely and effectively participate. And that's a shared responsibility that involves companies, it involves states, civil society, and all of us who benefit from the work that human rights defenders do. And the paper is intended as a starting point for that conversation.
Jade, thank you very much for that comprehensive and precise summary of the paper. And I'm going to pass the microphone now to Maeve. And Maeve, would you please tell us about your organization, Mothers Against Genocide, and about how you use social media in your activism? And if you have any thoughts on Mary's words and Jade's words, whether you see any that they've said reflected in your own experience.
Yeah. So I'm Maeve Holland. I started up the group Mothers Against Genocide in October 2023, along with my sisters and friends. We were all doing the advocacy where we're going to protests, all the rest of it, but we wanted to do more basically. So yeah, we started up the group and just a wee WhatsApp, Mothers Against Genocide, and we started then protesting using like basically art. Really, we wanted to, there was statistics and we wanted to humanize them. So we've done that through various displays, like we got all the names of the children babies who were killed from age 0 to 2, and each name will put on a baby grow, and made a huge display, organised a protest, and that protest, the display went viral on social media, so which led to an outpouring of women from all over the world wanting to join, wanting to know how they could help basically. But so social media has been a really important part of the work that we do. Obviously the mainstream media weren't putting on the news what was happening. They weren't reporting the genocide properly. So we felt, right, well, it's up to us then to get that news out there. So we started using the Instagram and TikTok, Facebook to, what do you call it, to get it out there and all the rest of it. But we found very quickly that the more we grew, the more restrictions that became on our account. And so if we were posting, for example, now none of us were very savvy at social media. We learned as we went, but we stuck to the guidelines strictly, just to make sure that we didn't get any of these restrictions. But they kept coming back with us. Like, so we were reporting like things that were happening in a hospital setting. They were coming back saying violence that's not in a hospital setting. Nudity was a big one. They kept removing our content, they restricted the account, they took the lives of us, they prevented us from collaborating. We got so many attacks from bad accounts calling us all sorts, saying that they hoped that we were raped and etc. Them comments were allowed to stay. They weren't removed by Meta, but us posting the truth on a daily basis, that was being removed straight away. And so we tried to counteract that. They were saying that we were spreading fake news as well. So we got the information, we got the newspaper reports, the online media reports. We supplied them all with all the stuff, but it still came back no restricted. They wouldn't lift them. So it was really a tough battle. And then obviously they then eventually closed our account altogether. And with the help of a wonderful lady, we got it back up and running again. But as with advice and all, but as with the other not everybody has that information. So people kept coming to us, how do we counteract that? How do we get our media back, our social media back up and running? We don't have the answers. We don't know. And now it's getting harder and harder. They've changed the whole outlay, so you can't re-report. So before, if something was on Al Jazeera, not all of our followers watch Al Jazeera, we were able to repost that. You can't do that anymore. They remove it, you get a restriction for it. So you can't repost. It has to be original content, as they say, and it's just making it harder and harder. And especially now then with the with mainstream media not reporting anything that's going on in Palestine, in Congo, in Sudan, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iran. So we feel it's our duty to, and it's either it's not getting any views or it's just being removed.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to the screen to Ian Levine. And Ian, formerly on the human rights team at Meta, and he's also with Human Rights Watch. And Ian, you've worked within Meta, one of the main companies operating social media platforms that human rights defenders use. And I'm asking you first about the study. Are you surprised at all about the findings of the study? And perhaps you could help us understand how these issues are talked about and dealt with inside companies like Meta.
Thank you. Great to be here. I just want to start by Mary paying tribute to you and the work that you've done in your mandate. You and I first met in the 1990s when you were head of Amnesty Ireland and I was head of the Amnesty UN office. So we go back a long way. So I'm thrilled to be here to support this meeting, and you've picked obviously an incredibly consequential issue to end your mandate. I mean, there are a few more critical issues for human rights defenders than the role of social media as you lay out in the scoping paper. Both the fact that it is a crucial platform for human rights defenders, without which very few of them can do their jobs, but at the same time, it can be a source of harassment and abuse. It can be a source of wrong or inconsistent content moderation decisions, and many of the other issues that Jade laid out in her excellent presentation on the key findings. And of course, as you note, this conversation is taking place, at a time of weakening engagement by most of the social media companies. I noted that when you talked about the consultation process for the scoping paper, you talked about consultations with human rights defenders, but as far as I know, the companies didn't respond to requests for information, which obviously is disappointing. At the same time, I think it's important to note that social media not only shapes the world, but it also reflects it. And we are living in a world that is increasingly polarized, where truth, facts, objectivity are contested in a way that perhaps they weren't 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that means that social media is a space that is enormously challenging for human rights defenders to navigate, and they often end up on the wrong side of decisions made by companies. Just to say a couple of words, and obviously I can't comment on the various pieces of content that were alleged to have been wrongly taken down by social media companies. I would just say that from my time at Meta, where I spent a lot of the time, I'm not sure how successfully, but I look to spend a lot of the time bridging the divide between the company and human rights defenders, given that I had spent literally decades in the human rights world. Not all content removed by the company was wrongly removed. And that's one of the things I do want to say towards the end, just a few possible recommendations about how to take forward the paper. And I think one of the things that I would emphasize is the importance of human rights defenders making sure that they really understand content policies, because they don't always do so. And for example, I think there was reference to the fact that human rights activists will sometimes share information about atrocities being committed by governments against peaceful populations, which obviously is a hugely important task that they do. But if they are sharing images that display graphic violence, that content will come down. And it's not that the social media companies are being anti-human rights or hostile to the cause of the human rights defenders. It's if it's displaying, you know, body parts and grisly footage and whatever, that footage will violate their content policies. So it's important that we as human rights defenders, that we really understand the policies, the content policies of the companies, to try and make sure that to the greatest extent possible that we're not getting around them. The other thing I want to mention that's crucially important, and Jade, I don't think you mentioned it, but I do want to flag it, is the importance of certain product features that companies have that can be crucially important for protecting the well-being and security of the accounts of human rights defenders. Just to give one example of many, when the Taliban when they took over Kabul in, I guess it was 2021 or 2022, we were extremely concerned. I was on the Meta Human Rights team at the time. We were extremely concerned that the Taliban would start reviewing the Facebook accounts of women human rights defenders and be looking at who their Facebook friends were, to start targeting those friends for being enemies of the Taliban. And so one of the things that we did, for example, was to reach out to Afghan women human rights defenders and introduce a feature called lock profiles, which helped protect, which essentially hid their friends list from those, except those to whom they gave access. So, and I'm not going to go into detail now, but just to say there are important product features that the companies can use to support and protect human rights defenders. Most defenders aren't aware of them, and so don't ask for them. And I think one thing that's really important, and I hope the paper can support this process, is helping ensure that human rights defenders are aware of the support and services that they can get. If I can, I just want to say a couple of words about sort of looking forward and how this important paper can contribute to ways of engaging with tech companies and social media companies to advance human rights defender protection. There were a couple of mentions already of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, extremely important, and too few human rights defenders know the UNGPs well. It's really important, if we're going to be able to effectively advocate with tech companies, that we use the language of the UN Guiding Principles that, as Jade set out their responsibilities. It's really important to push for tech companies to have human rights policies and to make sure that they include in those human rights policies a specific commitment to human rights defenders. We did that at Meta. Now, does it mean we always made the right decision to protect human rights defenders? No, it didn't. But that commitment was important, and it gave a lever to human rights defenders who could come to us and say, hey, you made this commitment, but something's going wrong, very badly wrong here. And it gave them some ammunition, if you like, to bring to us. The concerns that have been raised about declining interest on the part of companies around human rights issues is well noted, and I 100% agree. But that doesn't mean that there aren't good people inside companies who care and who will do everything they can from within to support human rights defenders and their social media accounts. So finding allies in companies and cultivating relationships with allies is super important. And one thing I would urge, and I'm sure it's already on your list of things to do, but I would really urge you to use this paper not just as a tool to criticize companies, but also as a tool to engage with those who are open to talking and sharing and learning together to see how shared solutions can be created. I would also strongly urge that you think about engaging with investors. I think investors are a hugely important ally, or can be hugely important allies to human rights activists when they're engaging with companies. There are some extremely human rights minded investors who really can make a difference and can bring concerns to companies through shareholder resolutions and other mechanisms. And so making them aware of the recommendations in the report and getting them to be allies and support you, I think is going to be hugely important. And maybe the last thing to say, and sorry if I've spoken too long, but this maybe the last thing to say is, and there was reference to it earlier on, but the link between online and offline harm is incredibly important. One of the most important things that human rights defenders can do vis-a-vis companies is to point out to them the real world harms that result from a failure to deal effectively with online content. There has been, as you all know, in the last 18 months, since the Trump administration took office, a kind of shift at the tech companies to move much more towards freedom of expression, because the Trump administration sees content moderation essentially as being censorship of conservative voices. And one of the, I think, the most critical arguments that we need to be able to make when we're asking companies to take down content that threatens or harms human rights defenders is to show the link between what's being said online and the real world harm that results. With that, let me say thank you again for giving me the chance to participate.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your comments and recommendations. We have time now for questions. Would anybody like to ask a question? So please put up your hand, do say who you are and who you'd like to direct your question to.
Not me.
Yeah.
I'm a dinosaur.
I can bring the microphone.
Sure, yeah. I'm Joe O'Brien. I'm the director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. I don't want to start a discussion on too negative a tone, but I feel we're assuming that social media companies have some sort of reasonable moral compass here. And that is not the case anymore. Maybe they had in the past, but they're very much political projects. Ian mentioned it just at the closing there. And I'm not sure I agree that they're worried about freedom of speech. I think the freedom of speech line is a sham for their own political project. They're clearly very anti-human rights, and that's a political decision that they've made on foot of the Trump administration and other things building up before that as well. So I feel maybe there's some soft usage in building allies within social media companies, but for me, it's about national governments tackling them and using the law and trying to implement the law, which they're not doing. And Ireland being one of the worst transgressors in that respect, particularly around data protection legislation, which we have a particular responsibility for. DPC in Ireland has a particular responsibility for in terms of European-based platforms. So a comment, I would say thank you. It's obviously very important that this piece of work is done. Because there's a war on human rights defenders, I think, and it's not an accidental one. I don't think it's happening because the platforms are orientated in a way that doesn't suit them. I think it's deliberate, and I'm not sure we can effectively tackle it unless we really name it for what it is, in my view, anyway.
Thanks for your comment. Ian or Jade, do you want to make a comment in response?
We should take a few questions.
Take one more and then come back.
Sure.
Thanks, Ian. My name is Olga. I work at ICCL as well. Thanks a million for the report and for your contributions there today. I was just wondering, just going to get into the specifics a little bit, but in your research, did you see any difference in terms of jurisdictions in how the companies responded to questions that Maeve might have had, like why is this been taken down, why is this staying up, those kinds of questions? Because the Digital Services Act is in its infancy, but it is supposed to provide this means of redress, but also answers for people when they have questions about those very specific things. It remains to be seen whether the DSA will be effective. But I just wondered if in the research, if you came across any kind of signs that people were getting those answers, those, those routes to remedy were actually effective.
Perhaps not.
That would be a quick answer, no. But to be fair, as well, in the scope and capacity that was applied to this study, I think did not allow us to go that much into detail and look at the thing jurisdiction per jurisdiction. From the get-go, our consultation rounds with human rights offenders and NGOs was about the challenges that they face, and so very often they themselves did not necessarily enter super into details into each case. It was more about painting with a broad brush stroke the key patterns, but we're hoping that the scoping paper will be used as a stepping stone to further research and by academics, other civil society members and companies and all that. So it would be definitely a very interesting angle to research.
Thanks a million. My name's Sarah Holland. I'm Maeve's sister, and I'm a member of Mothers Against Genocide as well. I think your research is really important, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. I just wanted to give 2 examples of where online harm came into real life. And the first was where Mothers Against Genocide had organised a Mother's Day vigil with the props, which represented dead children. It was very upsetting. But it was a silent vigil, it was very respectful, and the following morning the guards came and yeeted the women off the street, using quite an amount of force, arrested them and strip searched them, which was a violation of their rights. And the second example that I wanted to give was of a bake sale that we had organised to raise funds for Al Mawasi camp in Gaza. And the bake sale was in an area where support for human rights defenders, support for Palestine wasn't popular. So threats came in online against that bake sale, and they came in via Facebook. So the event was advertised on Facebook. It was a really positive kind of event because it was in East Belfast. It was in the Protestant community. It was organised by Protestant women, working class women like ourselves. And we had come together across the divide to challenge human rights abuses. But loyalist men came online and threatened the women organising it and the event, and it had to be moved. So that was an example of harm online coming into real life. But it left the women in a position, those 2 events, although they were different, one was in Dublin, one was in Belfast, showed that the state may make a lot of the right noises about human rights defenders, but in practice, they use their repressive state apparatus to also silence dissent in another way. So I think that this research is really important in that it'll reach the corridors of power, more so than we raise our voices in the street. It'll reach those with influence to actually make real changes in this area and maybe support those who fight for human rights defences on the streets. Thank you.
Ian, do you want to comment on any of the comments so far?
Sure. I'd like to come back to Joe's point, if I may. Joe, I hear you. I hear your enormous, not only distrust for, but sort of, I guess, contempt for the social media companies, and that's totally fine. And you're absolutely right that government action is super important, and it's vital that governments use rights-respecting legislation to seek to ensure that social media companies live up to their human rights responsibilities. But I would not give up on the idea of engagement. I do think that there are opportunities. They're significantly reduced from what they might have been 5 or 6 years ago, when I think that it was a very different time, particularly given what had happened in Myanmar in 2017, when Facebook, essentially was being used by extremists in Myanmar to incite genocide against the Rohingya, and that really created enormous shockwaves across social media and some real changes. Those times have definitely passed, but I wouldn't give up on the idea of engaging directly and using their own rhetoric to hold them to account. So Meta, which is the company I know Beth, having worked at, last January, as the Trump administration was taking office, pushed very strongly on the fact that they wanted to reaffirm their commitment to freedom of expression and open up space for more speech, even if it was offensive speech. Okay, so let's hold them to account. Let's remind them that when they allow human rights defenders to be bullied and harassed off platforms, that they are losing their freedom of expression. And we see it especially with women human rights defenders and LGBTQ human rights defenders and environmental activists. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both. I think we need to push governments. We need to be publicly critical of companies, but also need to seek to engage them around commitments they've made and see how we can have them accountable. Thank you.
Yes. Can I ask you a question? So having worked both in the human rights sphere and in Meta, have you considered writing up a set of recommendations, very concrete ones, that could help protect human rights defenders? As an expert in both the internal machinations of Meta and one of the good guys who was in Meta but got out, and your human rights work and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty for so long, I just think you'd be very well placed to take this on as a project with sufficient help from anybody else here would be willing, to help launch a campaign here in Ireland, at least, to try and get the state to fulfill its responsibilities because of all the headquartered European ones here.
It's a fascinating challenge. No, I hadn't thought about sort of publishing something, but if I could help write something that could support the advocacy for the scoping paper, let's talk, and let's see how I can support you.
And thank you again for the excellent paper. My name is Quiva DeBar. I work for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So I'm just thinking about the big case that we're all aware of that happened in the States last week, where the big tech companies were found liable for having actually pushed and promoted addictive algorithms, which led to incredibly awful harm for so many people. That one young woman in particular, but there's loads and loads of cases coming to follow that. I'm just wondering, I'm very well aware of human rights defenders, particularly female human rights defenders, suffering great harm as a result of what happens on these technology platforms. Are any of you aware of any legal cases against tech platforms because of harms that have resulted to human rights defenders? Or would you see this as a possibility or useful?
I shall have to bow to all the other experts in the room. I'm looking at a few of them. Do any of you know of any cases? Do any of you here know of any other cases where human rights defenders have taken on? I mean, you're talking about real power and might up here.
I was just going to say, I think that there's a lot of issues concerning its jurisdiction issues. Human rights defenders in certain jurisdictions would like to but they are struggling to find. Sorry, I should say ICCL is a member of an international network of 17 human rights and liberties organizations across the world, global north and global south. And a lot of our members in, let's say, African countries, Southeast Asian countries, especially in Indonesia, actually. One of our members was very badly treated after a YouTube webinar. But the trouble there is that they're struggling to find jurisdiction to take cases against the big tech companies, because they're just saying you can't sue us in this jurisdiction or whichever. So there's a big question there amongst, I think, some human rights defenders in some jurisdictions that are struggling to find those cases.
Hi, my name is Sarah from Frontline Defenders. Maybe just to say, I think one of the challenges to that question is the actual power that those companies hold. Like the Supreme Court in Brazil was sanctioned by the US government over a decision related to social media in the country. So I think it's part of the point the colleagues were making earlier, like what's actually the power that's in question when you're trying to hold them accountable, when they have so much power, and defenders come in a, just the David Goliath situation, like what exactly are we challenging at the power to actually do that? And just, sorry, because I reflect someone else's question, but maybe I just make a point on the conversation. I think one of, from the practical experience of responding to the risk of human rights defenders, we often find ourselves in a space of actually advising them to leave social media. And that's a very tricky space, because as flagged by the report, is often an important space for the work, particularly in a context where the public space has been delegated to private companies. So I think there is a discussion also on what are the alternatives the human rights defenders themselves are building for their work, which is a different discussion, but a complementary discussion, I feel, to that space of the risk that defenders are facing in the social media platforms.
I'd like to ask another question, for you, Jane, if I may. I found your report comprehensive. You covered.
Can you cross the mic?
Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Which areas would you like to return to that you've looked at, or are there areas you think merit further attention? I wonder, for example, the area of AI. You mentioned it briefly. Is there anything that you would like to follow up on now?
There's many. There's many, to be honest. There are regions of the world that I wish we'd receive more submissions from. We heard less from organizations working in Africa and in Central Asia, for example. So that was a bit of a blind spot there. And in terms of themes, it opens up a whole like spider's web of things to research, to be honest. AI is certainly creating a whole range of issues for defenders, and particularly women human rights defenders. Like they're facing just horrid personal attacks with AI generated content and deep fakes, and so it's definitely an area in which we would benefit from having more women researchers and women engineers and women anything, because this is and in general people from marginalized communities participating in building those systems, because right now they're built by the global majority and it is not friendly to everyone. So this is, I'm hoping that the human rights world is gonna contribute more to kind of building or trying to build those systems in a more equitable and human rights friendly way. Might be an uphill battle, another David versus Goliath situation, but yeah, worth a try always.
Can I just add one point to what Jade has just said? So just to complement it, not one thing. I think as she says, the issue of misinformation, AI-generated misinformation is hugely relevant to human rights defenders and of huge concern. One of the obligations that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights impose on companies is that they do human rights due diligence before they launch products and services, and that they identify the most salient, the most priority risks, and recognizing human rights defenders as high risks as they think about launching new products and AI is incredibly important. The Meta Oversight Board just 2 days ago issued what they call a policy advisory opinion, where they basically said to Meta that you have to keep up third-party fact-checking in countries in crisis, in repressive countries, in countries going through contested elections, precisely because if there is not proper third-party fact-checking, the risks of misinformation being used to bring harm to activists and other vulnerable groups is incredibly high. So really just to support what Jade has said about the importance of this issue.
This is Michael from Special Rapporteur team. I wanted to ask a question to Liv and maybe to you, Ian. Mary's social media channels have a lot of followers. And a couple of years ago, we saw a drastic reduction in the amount of people who were seeing the things that Mary was publishing online. A huge, seemingly wild number for example, somebody who has more than 70,000 people who follow her, something will be posted and be seen by maybe 100 people. And I wanted to know if, like you mentioned that a little bit, maybe like, is that something that Mothers Against Genocide have seen? And then maybe to Ian, like, in the report, it talks about issues such as shadow banning. I mean, like, this is something that we don't really have a lot of light on or any kind of transparency upon. Is it something you could talk about? Like, why would somebody like Mary's accounts or Mothers Against Genocide being seen by so few people?
Do we want to?
Yeah, that's a massive problem with us. We had we have now 150,000 followers, and we were growing at a massive rate, like very quickly. All of a sudden, it stopped. We were losing followers. Followers were being unfollowed. You know, people, our friends like myself, I unfollowed Mothers Against Genocide when I didn't. You know, these things were happening, and also we went from 18 million views to 3,000 views overnight. So people were trying to add us. So we're getting a message saying, you cannot follow this creator this time. Also, these creators, post false news, fake information, none of which we did. But it was like we were constantly fighting a battle. And in the last year, we've only grown by 6,000. So it shows you the level of banning that we have. Like, people were putting like hours into posts, like putting a whole week's worth of work into something like a post about child hostages in Israeli jails, and they were getting no views at all. So then that's where you would go ahead, you would collaborate with other human rights defending groups, other groups that took that off completely. So it's basically they were banning you into oblivion. They didn't want what we were posting, they didn't want it online, they didn't want to see it, and there's nothing we could do about it. Basically, we also, by the way, fundraise. We sell 7,000 a week to Gaza through the sale of our merch and through online donations. And TikTok was a really big one for that. We got plenty. We got 2 strikes for posting something about the Epstein files. You know, it's you can literally now on TikTok post nothing at all. You can't post anything about what's going on in Palestine. 15,000 followers, and we're getting 10 views. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
I mean, just briefly, because this is beyond my own expertise, but you know, a lot of it has to do with the recommender systems. Sometimes we've seen human rights organizations and human rights defenders complain about exactly the kind of issues that Maeve raises about sort of downranking of content and losing followers and losing their reach. In some cases, it occurs because of policies to downrank political and social content. A lot of the platforms did that 2 or 3 years back because they were being accused of intensifying polarization in society. So they sort of walked back from political content, and that certainly impacted the human rights organizations and entities like you, Mary. In other cases, it may come about because of hostile reporting from those opposed to the cause that is being promoted by the organization, and I suspect that may have contributed to some of your situations. So there are a lot of complex factors that go into it, and I do recognize that one of the biggest frustrations is that when these events happen, it's very, very difficult to get someone from the companies to be able to look at your accounts and try and help you understand what's going on and to fix it. So it is, I recognize, a big issue for many activists on a wide range of issues.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Dave. I think we could continue to speak, but we're coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to turn to Mary for last words for us, please.
It's clear to me that social media companies and the people that run them have all the power and the money and the lack of morals. Sorry, Ian. There are, of course, a few people within the companies, if you can find a needle in a haystack, like the way we found you, and you put back Mother Against Genocide's account, but it's such an imbalance of power. And the odds are stacked against human rights defenders who are people who are just trying to do the right thing, as you know. They may not have all the ins and outs, but regardless of what you said, I think the overwhelming evidence is that human rights defenders are smeared, attacked online, and that leads to offline and worse. So I would really like this, not Jade's paper and Michael, not to just finish here. I would really like to continue the conversation with you, Ian, and with perhaps ICCL and the Irish Commission of Human Rights and Equality. Sorry, it's always such a long name. And anyone else. Maybe we could put together a steering group, and maybe we could just start in Ireland and see how collectively there might be a possibility of advancing in some way the protection of human rights defenders on social media platforms, which is against the will of the platform holders, in my view, and also against the governments that are not taking their responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which, as you know, are only aspirational anyway, and no government is one that fulfills its obligations at the best of times. So that's what I'd like.
Thank you, Maeve. Thank you, Maeve, Jade, and Ian. Thank you very much for joining us, and to our audience too for the questions, the comments, and the engagement. And Mary, you may be stepping down your role, but you obviously have no intention of stepping out. I think you've said that another. Okay, there are just a few things we mentioned. The report is available on the Special Rapporteur's site. It's available in English, in French, in Spanish, in Arabic, and in Russian. There is a reception downstairs, and everyone is invited to come and continue the conversation.
And will you, if any of you are interested in forming some kind of steering committee to kind of think about ways in which to take the report forward step by step, please get in touch with us through the website, I suppose, is it? Yeah, but there's a contact form on the website. We'd really like that. Or individually, those of you who can.
And lastly, from the Centre for Social Innovation, we've had the pleasure of working with you for many, many years. We'd just like to add our thank you to you. And thank you very much. I'm very best wishes. Thank you, everyone. Please do continue downstairs.